The cruelest crowns are often placed on the kindest hearts before destiny changes everything. Every noble in the Crimson Citadel believed the Harvest Moon banquet would end with history repeating itself. Another proud vampire lady would be chosen to stand beside the throne. Another powerful bloodline would strengthen the kingdom. Another flawless smile would hide centuries of ambition. No one expected a frightened human girl carrying a silver serving tray to become the center of every whisper before the night was over. Grace Bennett adjusted the plain black sleeves of her borrowed uniform as she hurried through the endless marble corridors, silently reminding herself of the 3 rules her supervisor had repeated since sunrise. Never speak unless spoken to. Never look directly at the king. Never become memorable. Those rules sounded simple enough, yet nothing about the palace felt simple. Crystal chandeliers reflected thousands of golden lights across polished floors. Massive stained glass windows painted the walls with shades of crimson and sapphire. Noble vampires drifted through the ballroom with impossible grace, their elegant gowns and tailored suits making Grace feel invisible even before anyone noticed the inexpensive shoes beneath her dress. She had spent the last 4 years taking every honest job she could find after losing her parents and their small bakery in Portland. Waiting tables, cleaning offices, delivering groceries, none of it mattered tonight. This single catering shift promised enough money to cover 2 months of rent and finally replace the leaking roof above her tiny apartment. She couldn't afford one mistake. At the far end of the ballroom stood the obsidian throne, carved from a single piece of volcanic stone polished until it reflected the candlelight like black glass. Upon it sat King Lucian Ashford, ruler of every vampire house across North America. Stories described him as immortal, brilliant, and utterly impossible to impress. Grace had expected someone terrifying. Instead, she found someone disturbingly calm. His perfectly tailored black suit looked almost ordinary compared to the jeweled robes surrounding him, yet every conversation seemed to bend around his silent presence. His pale face revealed nothing. His silver-gray eyes never lingered on anyone long enough to offer comfort. Even from across the room, his stillness commanded more attention than the orchestra filling the ballroom with elegant music. "Bring another bottle to the royal table," whispered Marcus, the head steward, shoving a crystal decanter into Grace's trembling hands. "And whatever happens, keep your eyes down." Grace nodded quickly and stepped toward the raised platform. Hundreds of conversations faded beneath the pounding of her own heartbeat. Every careful step felt heavier than the last. She reached the royal table, lowered the bottle, and carefully poured the dark crimson drink into a crystal goblet. For one hopeful second, everything seemed perfect. Then a proud noblewoman wearing a diamond crown deliberately shifted her chair backward. The movement brushed Grace's elbow. The crystal goblet tipped sideways, spilling a thin ribbon of wine across the polished edge of the king's table. Silence swept through the ballroom so completely that Grace could hear her own breathing. She froze. Marcus covered his face in horror. The noblewoman smiled almost too innocently. Grace opened her mouth to apologize, but before a single word escaped, King Lucian slowly lifted his eyes and looked directly at the trembling human girl standing before his throne. Grace could not breathe. The entire ballroom remained perfectly still, as though even time itself feared making another mistake. King Lucian Ashford did not raise his voice. He did not stand from the obsidian throne. He simply looked at the young woman before him with calm silver eyes that revealed nothing, and somehow that silence felt heavier than any angry accusation. Grace lowered her head immediately. "Your Majesty, I am deeply sorry. It was an accident." Her words trembled despite every effort to remain composed. Around the royal platform, whispers spread like a cold wind through autumn leaves. Several noble vampires exchanged amused smiles while others watched with quiet curiosity, sensing entertainment where Grace saw only disaster. Marcus hurried forward, nearly dropping to one knee. "Your Majesty, the servant is inexperienced. Please allow me to dismiss her immediately." Before Grace could speak again, a soft laugh echoed across the platform. It came from Lady Seraphine, the elegant noblewoman whose chair had unexpectedly shifted moments earlier. She slowly lifted her jeweled glass and smiled as though the evening had become far more enjoyable. "A human serving the royal table was already a generous exception," she said smoothly. Perhaps tonight reminds us why traditions exist. A few nobles nodded in agreement. Grace kept her eyes fixed on the polished marble beneath her feet. She understood exactly what they wanted. They wanted someone beneath them to blame. Someone who could carry the embarrassment away so the celebration could continue untouched. King Lucian finally rose from his throne. The orchestra immediately fell silent. Hundreds of guests instinctively stepped back as he descended the short staircase with measured confidence. His polished shoes stopped only a few feet from Grace. She could feel every heartbeat racing inside her chest, yet she forced herself not to retreat. "Look at me," he said quietly. Grace hesitated before slowly lifting her eyes. The king studied her face for only a moment. There was no anger in his expression, no kindness either, only impossible composure. Then, before the entire royal court, he spoke words that landed heavier than the spilled wine itself. "A servant who cannot even carry a glass without trembling has no place near my throne." The ballroom erupted with restrained laughter. Some nobles hid amused smiles behind crystal glasses. Others openly shook their heads as though they had expected nothing more from a human girl. Grace felt heat rise across her face. Every instinct urged her to cry, to defend herself, to explain what had truly happened. Instead, she quietly lowered her head once more. "You are correct, Your Majesty." Her answer surprised everyone, including Lucian himself. She did not argue. She did not accuse Lady Seraphine. She accepted the humiliation with a dignity no one expected. Marcus gently removed the tray from her shaking hands, avoiding eye contact. "Go," he whispered. "Leave before this becomes worse." Grace offered one respectful bow before turning toward the grand staircase. Each step away from the royal platform felt lighter than the shame pressing against her heart. She had lost the best-paying job she had ever found. Rent would be impossible next month. The roof above her apartment would continue leaking every time it rained. Yet even then, she refused to let bitterness follow her through the palace doors. Outside, the cool evening air wrapped around the quiet palace gardens. Moonlight rested across marble pathways lined with ancient white roses. Grace wiped away the single tear that had escaped before taking a slow breath. Somewhere beyond the hedges came the faint sound of someone struggling to walk. Without thinking about the banquet, the king, or her own broken future, Grace turned toward the sound, unaware that the next choice she made would quietly begin rewriting the destiny of an entire kingdom. Grace followed the faint sound along a winding stone path where the music from the banquet slowly disappeared behind towering hedges. The moon hung high above the palace gardens, covering every flower and fountain with a silver glow that made the world feel strangely peaceful after the humiliation she had just endured. The sound came again, not a cry for help, more like someone struggling to catch a steady breath. Grace rounded a marble archway and found an elderly woman sitting alone on a weathered stone bench beside a quiet, reflecting pool. She wore a simple gray shawl over an elegant dark gown that seemed almost too refined for someone wandering without attendance. One hand rested gently against her chest, while the other searched blindly for a silver cane that had fallen onto the grass. Grace hurried forward without hesitation. "Please do not move too quickly," she said softly. "I will get it for you." She picked up the cane, brushed away the dew with her sleeve, and carefully placed it into the woman's waiting hand. The older woman smiled with grateful eyes that carried both warmth and quiet sadness. "Thank you, dear. Most people are too busy watching the palace lights to notice an old woman." Grace returned a gentle smile. "My grandmother used to say that the people who need kindness the most are often the quietest." The woman studied her carefully. "You have been crying." Grace instinctively touched her cheek before lowering her hand with an embarrassed laugh. "Only for a minute. There are many people carrying burdens much heavier than mine." The older woman tilted her head with curiosity. "You lost something tonight." Grace looked toward the distant ballroom where golden light poured from the tall windows. "Only a job," she answered honestly. "Jobs can be found again. Character is harder to replace." The elderly woman remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. "You do not sound angry." Grace slowly sat beside her on the stone bench. "Being angry would not repair a broken roof or pay next month's rent. I would rather spend my energy helping someone if I can." A cool breeze drifted through the roses. The older woman suddenly shivered despite the heavy shawl around her shoulders. Without giving it another thought, Grace removed her own light cardigan and carefully placed it over the woman's shoulders. "You need this more than I do," she said. "The palace is warm. Outside feels colder than it looks." The woman's eyes widened in surprise. "And what about you?" Grace smiled. "I have walked through plenty of cold evenings. I will be all right." Before the woman could answer, her breathing became uneven once more. Grace immediately knelt beside her. "May I?" she asked gently. Receiving a quiet nod, she rested 2 fingers lightly against the woman's wrist, just as her father had once taught her when checking on exhausted customers at the family bakery. "Slow breaths," Grace whispered. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. There is no rush." The older woman followed her rhythm. Within moments, the tension gradually faded from her expression. Color returned to her pale face. She opened her eyes with visible relief. "Remarkable," she murmured. "I have not felt this peaceful in months." Neither of them noticed the silent figure standing beneath the shadows of a nearby stone balcony. King Lucian had left the banquet only moments earlier, intending to clear his thoughts after the unexpected scene inside the ballroom. Instead, he stood perfectly still as he watched the young human girl he had publicly humiliated offering quiet compassion to someone she believed was nothing more than a lonely stranger. For the first time that evening, the unshakable king found himself questioning whether he had judged Grace Bennet far too quickly. King Lucian remained hidden beneath the shadow of the stone balcony long after Grace believed she was alone. The cool night breeze stirred the ancient oak branches overhead, carrying the scent of white roses across the silent garden. He had witnessed countless displays of generosity during his 4 centuries upon the throne, but most had been carefully performed in front of powerful eyes, each act expecting admiration or reward. This had been different. Grace Bennet had believed no one was watching. She had given away the only warm cardigan she owned without hesitation. She had comforted a stranger after losing the most important job of her life. She had expected nothing in return. That simple truth unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The elderly woman slowly rose from the bench with Grace's help before placing one gentle hand over the young woman's fingers. "You have a rare heart, my dear," she said with a quiet smile. "Please promise me that no matter what this palace says about you, you will never let them convince you otherwise." Grace smiled modestly. "My parents always believed kindness was worth keeping, even when it was difficult." The older woman nodded thoughtfully. "Wise people." Grace glanced toward the palace entrance. "I should leave before the last bus into the city. Thank you for keeping me company." She bowed politely before turning toward the garden gate, disappearing beyond rows of moonlit hedges until only the sound of her footsteps remained. Silence settled once again. Then the elderly woman's gentle expression transformed into calm authority. "You may come out now, Lucian." The king stepped from the shadows without surprise. There was no point pretending he had not been there. He inclined his head respectfully. "Mother." Queen Mother Eleanor looked toward the empty pathway where Grace had vanished. "You embarrassed an innocent girl before your entire court." Lucian answered without emotion. "She made a mistake during a royal ceremony." Eleanor slowly turned to face him. "Did she?" Her question lingered between them. "Or did someone make certain she would?" Lucian's silver eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He replayed the moment in his mind. The shifting chair. The perfect timing. Lady Seraphine's satisfied smile. Tiny details that had seemed insignificant inside the ballroom suddenly formed a pattern that refused to disappear. Eleanor continued quietly. The girl never defended herself. She never blamed another person, even after losing everything. Lucian remained silent. Instead, Eleanor said, touching the cardigan still resting upon her shoulders, "She helped someone she believed was an ordinary old woman sitting alone in a garden." Lucian looked toward the cardigan. It was faded from years of careful washing. One sleeve had been repaired by hand with thread that almost matched the fabric. It was not valuable, yet somehow it felt more meaningful than every jeweled cloak hanging inside the royal palace. Eleanor smiled knowingly. "Do you remember the prophecy hidden beneath the Hall of Records?" Lucian's expression hardened. "Ancient legends belong in books, not government." "Not all of them," Eleanor replied softly. "Some were written to be recognized rather than believed." She reached beneath the cardigan and revealed a small silver pendant resting against her gown. Its smooth surface, silent for decades, now glowed with the faintest golden light. Lucian stared at it without speaking. He had not seen that relic respond since childhood. It reacted the moment she touched my hand. Eleanor whispered. No noble family has awakened it in 170 years. A quiet chill passed through the garden despite the gentle summer air. Lucian looked toward the palace where laughter still echoed from the unfinished banquet. Somewhere inside, ambitious nobles continued discussing alliances, titles, and power. None of them realized that the greatest mystery of the evening had already walked through the front gate carrying nothing except an empty purse, a kind heart, and the certainty that she would never see the palace again. For reasons he could not explain, Lucian no longer believed that would be true. The following morning, sunlight spilled across the city, but Grace Bennet barely noticed its warmth. She stood behind the worn wooden counter of a neighborhood bakery on the edge of Portland, asking once again whether they needed an extra pair of hands. The elderly owner offered an apologetic smile before shaking his head. I wish I could help, Miss Bennet. Business has been slow all month. Grace thanked him anyway. She never argued. She never begged. She simply wished him a good day and stepped back onto the sidewalk with another polite smile that disappeared the moment the door closed behind her. 3 more interviews ended the same way before noon. By early afternoon, she counted the remaining bills inside her wallet. They would cover groceries for a week, perhaps 2 if she skipped lunch. Rent was due in 12 days. She quietly folded the money back into her purse and continued walking. Across the city, inside the towering halls of the Crimson Citadel, an entirely different conversation had begun. The royal council assembled around a circular obsidian table beneath a ceiling painted with the history of every vampire dynasty. Lady Seraphine stood gracefully before the gathered nobles, her jeweled gown shimmering beneath crystal chandeliers. Your Majesty, she began with measured confidence, last night's incident should not be dismissed as a simple accident. Lucian remained seated at the head of the chamber, his expression unreadable. Continue. Seraphine inclined her head respectfully. The human girl remained within the palace grounds after being dismissed. We know nothing about her intentions. If she somehow learned information regarding royal customs, court security, or members of the council, she represents an unnecessary risk. Several nobles nodded in agreement. Lord Victor folded his hands across the polished table. Humans have always been curious about what does not belong to them. It would be wise to ensure she never returns. Another council member added quietly. Kindness toward one human quickly becomes expectation from many others. Lucian listened without interruption. Every sentence sounded logical. Every argument appeared reasonable. Yet none of them explained the faint golden light he had seen shining from his mother's ancient pendant. None of them explained why Grace had offered her only cardigan to someone she believed was an ordinary stranger. Queen Mother Eleanor entered the chamber without announcement. Every noble immediately stood. She looked around the room before resting her calm gaze upon Seraphine. Interesting, Eleanor said softly. You seem remarkably concerned about a young woman who supposedly means nothing. Seraphine smiled with perfect composure. I am only protecting the kingdom. Eleanor nodded once. Then perhaps you would not object to a proper investigation before passing judgment. Silence followed. Lucian finally spoke. I agree. Several council members exchanged uncertain glances. The king continued in the same calm voice. Commander Rowan. The captain of the Royal Guard stepped forward immediately. Your Majesty. Locate Grace Bennet. The room became completely still. Lucian's next words carried the quiet certainty of royal command. She is not to be frightened, threatened, or treated as a suspect. Offer transportation if she accepts it. If she refuses, respect her decision. I simply wish to speak with her. Lady Seraphine's confident smile faded for the first time. Your Majesty, surely this matter does not deserve personal attention. Lucian looked directly at her. That decision belongs to the throne. No one challenged him again. Hundreds of miles away, Grace sat alone on a park bench overlooking the Willamette River, studying a handwritten list of businesses that might still be hiring before winter arrived. She had no idea that at that very moment, the most powerful guards in the vampire kingdom had quietly begun searching every neighborhood in the city, not to capture her, but to find the one human whom the king himself could no longer forget. Commander Rowan found Grace Bennet just before sunset. She was leaving a small community center after spending 2 unpaid hours helping children organize donated books simply because one volunteer had become overwhelmed. When the last box was placed neatly onto the shelf, Grace thanked everyone, adjusted the worn shoulder strap of her canvas bag, and quietly stepped outside. She had earned nothing except a grateful smile from the elderly librarian. Rowan watched from across the street without interrupting. The reports had been accurate. Every witness described the same woman. Honest, humble, unusually kind. Nothing about her suggested hidden ambition. He approached only after the sidewalk had nearly emptied. Miss Grace Bennett. Grace turned cautiously. The tall man wore a dark tailored coat with a silver crest embroidered near the collar. His posture was disciplined, yet his expression remained respectful. Yes. Rowan offered a slight bow. My name is Rowan. I serve the royal household. His Majesty King Lucian Ashford wishes to speak with you. Grace blinked twice, convinced she had misunderstood. There must be some mistake. There is no mistake. I was dismissed from the palace yesterday. Rowan nodded once. I am aware. Grace looked down the quiet street, as if expecting someone else to appear. If this is about the banquet, I have already accepted responsibility. I do not have the money to repay the damaged glassware, but I can make monthly payments if necessary. Rowan almost smiled. No payment has been requested. Grace studied his face carefully. Then why would the king wish to see me? Rowan answered truthfully. His Majesty did not explain. Grace hesitated. Every instinct warned her to decline. Palaces belonged to people with titles, wealth, and influence. She possessed none of those things. I appreciate the invitation, she said gently, but I do not think returning would be appropriate. Rowan expected that answer. His Majesty instructed me to respect your decision if you refused. Grace looked surprised. He said that, word for word. Silence settled between them. Before Grace could respond again, hurried footsteps echoed from the opposite side of the street. An elderly man carrying several grocery bags stumbled as one of the paper sacks split open, sending fruit rolling across the sidewalk toward the busy intersection. Without thinking, Grace rushed forward. Apples scattered into the street just as the traffic signal changed. She quickly gathered them before passing cars reached the crosswalk, placing every piece of fruit back into the remaining bags. Are you hurt? She asked. The old man smiled gratefully. Only embarrassed. Grace laughed softly. That happens to everyone. Rowan watched the entire moment without speaking. She had forgotten the royal invitation within seconds because someone else needed help. There was no audience. No applause. Only instinct. As the grateful man continued home, Rowan quietly reached into his coat and removed a small leather notebook issued to every royal commander. Beneath Grace Bennett's name, he added one final observation. She consistently places the needs of strangers above her own. He closed the notebook and looked toward Grace again. Miss Bennett, if I may make one personal observation. She nodded politely. People spend lifetimes hoping to be noticed by the throne. You seem determined to avoid it. Grace smiled with quiet sincerity. I have learned that peaceful lives are usually happier ones. Rowan looked toward the black royal vehicle waiting at the curb. I am beginning to suspect, Miss Bennett, that peace may no longer be one of the choices available to you. Grace stood quietly beneath the fading light, her fingers wrapped around the strap of her canvas bag as Rowan's words lingered in her mind. Peace may no longer be one of the choices available to you. She wanted to laugh at how impossible that sounded. She was an unemployed waitress with overdue rent and a tiny apartment that leaked whenever it rained. Powerful kings did not change the lives of women like her. Please thank His Majesty for his invitation, she said gently. But I believe it is better if I continue my life away from the palace. Rowan studied her expression carefully. There was no fear in her eyes, only quiet determination. Before he could respond, his phone vibrated softly inside his coat. He stepped aside and answered in a respectful tone. Commander Rowan speaking. The voice on the other end spoke only a few sentences before the commander's posture changed. Understood, Your Majesty. He ended the call and returned to Grace. His Majesty anticipated your answer. Grace looked surprised once again. Rowan reached into his pocket and produced a small ivory envelope sealed with black wax bearing the royal crest. The king asked me to give you this only if you refuse to return. Grace accepted it carefully. Inside was a single handwritten sentence in elegant script. If you value honesty as much as my mother believes you do, Allow me one conversation so that I may correct a mistake. There was no royal order, no threat, no demand, only a request. Grace read the sentence twice before quietly folding the letter. She had expected pride from a king, not humility. Tomorrow morning, she said at last. One conversation. Nothing more. Rowan smiled for the first time. I will inform His Majesty. The following morning, a black luxury sedan arrived precisely at 9 o'clock outside Grace's apartment building. She wore her cleanest blue dress, carefully pressed despite its age, and carried nothing except her canvas bag. During the drive toward the Crimson Citadel, neither she nor Rowan spoke very much. The city slowly disappeared behind rolling green hills until the palace emerged once again against the morning sky. This time, however, everything felt different. Guards who had ignored her the previous evening now respectfully opened the enormous iron gates. Palace attendants greeted her with polite bows instead of suspicious glances. Grace could not understand why. Inside the grand hall, King Lucian waited alone beside towering windows overlooking the royal gardens. No council members, no orchestra, no nobles, only silence. As Grace approached, Lucian turned to face her. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Then, to Grace's complete surprise, the king inclined his head. It was not a deep bow, but it was unmistakably a gesture of respect. "Miss Bennet," he said calmly, "I owe you an apology." Grace blinked, uncertain she had heard correctly. Lucian continued before she could answer. "Yesterday, I judged your mistake without seeking the truth. A king should never confuse incomplete knowledge with justice." Grace searched his face for sarcasm, but found none. "Your Majesty, I accepted what happened. That does not make it right." His words echoed softly through the empty hall. Before Grace could respond, the massive chamber doors suddenly opened. Lady Seraphine entered with several council members, clearly surprised to find the king speaking privately with the human girl. Her pleasant smile disappeared almost instantly. The council members exchanged uneasy glances as they witnessed something they had never expected to see. The king of the vampires was offering respect to the very human servant he had humiliated only one day before. And in that silent moment, every carefully arranged plan inside the royal court began to unravel. The silence inside the grand hall lasted only a heartbeat before Lady Seraphine recovered her composure. She stepped forward with effortless elegance, offering the king a graceful bow while never taking her eyes off Grace. "Your Majesty," she said smoothly. The council was informed that this meeting concerned palace security. We did not realize it had become personal. Several nobles behind her exchanged knowing glances, hoping the remark would pressure Lucian into distancing himself from the human girl. Instead, the king answered with perfect calm. "It concerns justice." The simple reply echoed through the chamber more loudly than anyone expected. Seraphine smiled politely, but the warmth had vanished from her expression. "Justice is important, of course, which is precisely why tradition must be respected. Every ruler before you understood that the throne remains strong only when clear boundaries are maintained." Lucian looked directly at the council members gathered behind her. "Then allow us to discuss tradition honestly." He turned toward Grace. "Miss Bennet, yesterday you believed Lady Seraphine accidentally moved her chair before the wine spilled." Grace hesitated. She had never wanted to accuse anyone. "I assumed it was simply unfortunate timing." Lucian nodded once. "Commander Rowan." The commander stepped forward carrying a small crystal sphere no larger than an apple. Murmurs spread across the chamber. Every noble recognized the ancient memory crystal, an artifact that quietly preserved brief moments occurring nearby. Rowan placed it upon a marble pedestal. A soft silver light filled the room. Moments later, a shimmering image appeared above the crystal. The previous evening unfolded exactly as it had happened. Grace carefully approached the royal table. The wine poured steadily. Then, just before the glass tipped, Lady Seraphine deliberately shifted her chair backward with a subtle movement almost impossible to notice with ordinary eyes. The image faded. Complete silence followed. Grace stared at the empty air, unable to believe what she had witnessed. She had replayed that moment dozens of times in her mind, always blaming herself. She had never imagined someone had quietly arranged her humiliation. Seraphine's confident smile disappeared. "Your Majesty," she began carefully. "The recording lacks context. Lucian interrupted gently but firmly. The context is clear enough. He looked toward Grace. Yesterday you accepted blame for something you did not cause. You protected another person's dignity while sacrificing your own. Grace lowered her eyes. I did not want more conflict. Queen Mother Eleanor smiled softly from the rear of the chamber. Exactly as I expected. Several council members shifted uneasily. The discussion they believed would end with the human girl's removal had become an examination of their own conduct. Lucian slowly descended the marble steps until he stood beside Grace once more. This time, every noble noticed that he chose to stand at her side rather than above her. Miss Bennet, he said quietly, there is one final question I wish to ask. Grace looked up. If you had known the truth yesterday, would you have exposed Lady Seraphine before everyone? Grace thought for several long seconds. The chamber remained perfectly still. Finally, she answered in the same calm voice she had used throughout every hardship. No, Your Majesty. Surprise spread across every face. Even Lucian appeared genuinely curious. Why? Grace smiled sadly. Because embarrassing someone rarely teaches kindness. I would rather give people the opportunity to become better than give them a reason to become more bitter. No one spoke. The words hung in the vast hall like the final note of a beautiful song. In that extraordinary moment, Lucian realized the ancient prophecy had never spoken about royal blood, hidden magic, or forgotten power. It had spoken about a heart so steady that even humiliation could not persuade it to abandon compassion. And for the first time since claiming the throne centuries earlier, the king understood why destiny had quietly led Grace Bennet back into his palace. No one moved. The words Grace had spoken settled over the grand hall with a quiet power that no ancient law or royal decree could match. The council members who had spent centuries debating bloodlines, titles, and political alliances found themselves unable to answer a single human woman whose greatest strength was simply choosing kindness when bitterness would have been easier. King Lucian looked around the chamber slowly. Every face reflected the same realization. The throne had been searching for loyalty in noble families, wisdom in old traditions, and greatness in powerful names. Yet the rarest quality in the entire kingdom had arrived wearing a simple blue dress and carrying a canvas bag. Lucian stepped toward the center of the hall where the royal platform overlooked the assembled court. His voice remained calm, but every word carried absolute authority. For generations we have measured worth by ancestry, wealth, and influence. Yesterday, I made that same mistake. He turned toward Grace. Miss Bennet, before this court, I ask your forgiveness, not because you require it, but because justice requires truth. Grace felt every eye upon her once again, but this time there was no laughter, no whispered mockery, only silence. She answered with the same humility that had guided every choice she had made. Your Majesty, I accepted your apology the moment you offered it. Queen Mother Eleanor smiled warmly. Several older council members quietly lowered their heads, recognizing a dignity they had overlooked. Lady Seraphine remained motionless. Pride urged her to speak, but wisdom told her that the moment no longer belonged to her. Lucian slowly raised one hand. A palace attendant approached carrying a small velvet cushion upon which rested an elegant silver brooch shaped like a white rose surrounded by delicate vines. This emblem, Lucian announced, has never represented power. It represents honor. It is given only to those whose character strengthens the kingdom. He accepted the brooch and walked toward Grace himself. The enormous hall became so quiet that even the distant fountain outside could be heard through the open windows. With careful respect, Lucian fastened the silver rose onto the collar of Grace's dress. It was the highest civilian honor the kingdom could bestow. Grace looked down at the small emblem in astonishment. Your Majesty, I do not know what to say. Lucian answered with a faint smile that surprised everyone who knew him. Then allow your actions to continue speaking, as they always have. One by one, the members of the royal council stood, then the palace guards, then every attendant inside the hall. None had been ordered to do so. Their respect had been earned. Grace felt tears gather in her eyes, not because she had received recognition, but because for the first time since entering the palace, she no longer felt invisible. Months passed. Grace accepted an invitation to serve as Queen Eleanor's advisor for the kingdom's charitable foundations, helping hospitals, schools, and families throughout both the human and vampire communities. Her compassion slowly transformed traditions that had remained unchanged for centuries. Throughout that time, Lucian often sought her counsel, discovering that her quiet honesty solved problems that politics never could. Their friendship grew naturally through shared purpose, mutual respect, and countless conversations overlooking the palace gardens where everything had quietly begun. When Lucian eventually asked Grace to stand beside him, it was not because of prophecy, status, or destiny alone. It was because she had already proven herself to be the partner his kingdom truly needed. On the day she became queen, the same grand hall where she had once stood in humiliation welcomed her with applause instead of silence. As Lucian gently placed the royal crown upon her head, he looked into her eyes and said softly, "The greatest throne is not built by power. It is built by the person who reminds a king how to be worthy of it." And those who witnessed that moment would remember it for generations, not because a human girl became a queen, but because kindness accomplished what power alone never could.